which is what in the hell gave us the idea that we were entitled to the oil in the first place? And the answer to that isn't just capitalism. The answer to that is white world supremacy. And if we aren't clear on the motivation for this behavior, the motivation that leads us to believe that certain countries run by white or so-called white people are entitled to have weapons of mass destruction, and as many of them as we want, but other nations run by peoples of color are not, then we're talking about white world supremacy. If we're going to have a policy announced by Dick Cheney in the aftermath of 9/11 that we're going to fight the war on terrorism against as many as 50 countries, this is what the man said. And then you do a little digging and you find that Al-Qaeda operates in 64 countries. And I was a little confused, because, hell, if we're going to fight this thing, let's fight this thing. You got 64 enemies, you're only going to fight 50. What kind of half-ass war is that? And then you start digging to find out, well, now who's the 14 that we're not going to pay any attention to? Because I want to know. Oh, but you see, that's 12 European nations, the U.S. and Canada. The other 50 are all nations that are nations of color. So isn't that convenient? So that is not just about capitalism. That's about white world supremacy. And so we can't ignore that for fear that's going to turn people off. But that's what the anti-war movement in many ways has done. We hear people saying, well, now we have to be rational and moderate because we have to bring in these moderate white people into the anti-war movement. Yeah. Normally that provokes sustained laughter. I'll just provide it for you since y'all are just sitting there like... Once again, moderate white people not in movement, not because of the way that we say what we say, but because they're not ready to be there and they haven't been given an alternative vision of what a just foreign policy and a just military policy and a just domestic policy would be. So why would they? And we can't continue to ignore these kinds of things. We can't continue to talk about health care reform as if the only issue was affordability, which is what a lot of nice white liberal health care folks do. We need to make health care more affordable. Yeah, no crap. And we also need to deal with the fact that even when it is affordable and even when people of color can get it, they get unequal and inferior care because doctors treat them differently. That's got nothing to do with affordability. You can have all the money in the world, and if the doctor still looks at you as if you're an inferior human being who can't follow a treatment regimen, and that's what the studies suggest happened, then all you've done is had a better funded apartheid healthcare system. What good is that? Or nice white liberals who are teachers who say, we need more money for schools, and that's their whole shtick. We just got to have more money. If the schools just had more money, we'd be fine. No Child Left Behind would be okay if it was just funded. But that's nonsense. Because it ignores the fact that we have a fundamentally systemic and institutionalized policy within education to segment and to track and to divide white peoples from people of color and to elevate white peoples above people of color so we can fund it, and all we get is a better funded apartheid system. So we must make racism and anti-racism a core component of any organizing that we do against ridiculous laws like No Child Left Behind. A better funded apartheid system does no good for the victims of that system. And if we're not willing to say that, we're not going to get very far. Here we are in a post-election environment where too many people on the left, and now I'm defining the left very broadly, okay? That is to say, anyone from a liberal Democrat over on the left are saying similar things. They're saying them for different reasons, slightly differently in tone and content, but largely the same thing. And coming from the mouths of either, it's problematic. On the one hand, you have the liberal Democratic type position represented, let's say, by best-selling author Thomas Frank, right, who writes this book, What's the Matter with Kansas? And this is a book which essentially asks the question, and it's a valid question to ask, right? Why is it that working class people and lower middle class folks consistently seem to be voting against their rational economic interest as workers, etc., and instead voting for reactionary candidates whose economic policies are really not in their interest and actually are even counter to their interest, and instead voting on the basis of other types of politics, be they the politics of evangelical Christianity, the politics of heterosexist backlash against gay and lesbian liberation, etc. And that's a good question to ask, but it's not quite a complete and honest question, and the answer he provides is even more problematic. Because you see, The question, first of all, assumes that working class people are monolithically voting against their interests. But now, that's not exactly true. People of color who are working class seem to be pretty damn clear about their interest. It's only white working class and lower middle class folks who seem to not understand it. So it ain't what's the matter with Kansas, it's what's the matter with white folks. We got people running around after this election saying this was evangelical Christian backlash. But not exactly. Because 6 or 7 to 1 in the black evangelical Christian community voted against the president. So it's not evangelical Christians and what's wrong with them, it's what's the matter with white folks. We got folks talking about red state, blue state, like the whole damn thing was just a geographic divide. But then you look at some of those blue states and you notice, like this one, that the slight majority of those called white in many of those states, including California, including Illinois, including the state of New York, voted for the president. So, and of course in the red states, the vast majority of people of color voted against him. So it isn't a geographic divide, it's a racial divide. What is the matter with white folks? And then the answer that Thomas Frank offers, unfortunately, is the typical one. And this is where the left, the real left, not the Thomas Frank left, the left, also sometimes chimes in. And I've done this. I think it's what most all of us have said. Every time an election turns out really, really horribly, which is like every time, no matter who wins, we always say the same thing. We always say the same thing. We always say, well, now, if the Democratic Party, we don't really trust that they will, but this is what we say. If the Democratic Party would just explain to these people, this is what Thomas Frank says, if we could just get to these working class people and explain their true class interest and make them see, if the Democratic Party would just return to a politics of class, I'm not sure when we ever were really pushing that in the Democrat, but whatever. Return to a politics of class, then we could appeal to the class interest and we would have solidarity across racial lines and all this other silliness and everything would be fine. And that's what some left community organizers still say, right? White ones, right? They say, well, now that's what we need to do. Let's go into the workplaces and organize on the basis of class solidarity and all that race stuff will just go away. Because we'll show people what their real class interest is. This is both a liberal democratic approach and an approach that comes out of traditional Marxist theory as well, and both are wrong. And the reason they are both wrong is because they ignore the fundamental reasons why white persons who are working class regularly vote against their interests. It ain't just stupidity. It's not just that people just aren't intelligent, which is, of course, paternalistic and insulting. How are you going to organize someone by going up to him and say, hey, dumbass, you need to vote this way? I know you don't realize that because you've been suckered, but it's okay because I'm here to explain it to you. Yeah, try that in the Union Hall and watch how quickly you get run out. Folks that say that works, never organized. Okay? So here's the problem. First, it's only the white working class ignoring their interest. It's only the white evangelical Christians ignoring their interest. And it's also the white men. There's a new book out also, Stephen Ducott. It's a really good book, actually, called The Wimp Factor, which is an examination of why men tend to gravitate toward a reactionary and authoritarian politics, sort of a backlash politics. It's really a very good book. But once again, it takes whiteness as the norm for granted, because the idea is, well, why is it that men gravitate toward these... But it ain't just men, because black and brown men still voting different, so what's the matter with white people? But see, Tom Frank doesn't want to ask that question. Steve Ducott doesn't want to ask that question. The Democratic Party definitely doesn't want to ask that question. And a lot of the left doesn't, but we must. Let me suggest there are a few reasons why white folks are, even when their class interests are in line with much more progressive and even radical policies, continue to ignore those interests. We need to understand why white folks do this if we're going to be effective at building movements. Okay? We can't just say, I remember when I was in Louisiana in 1990, I got out of college and I started doing work in the anti-David Duke campaigns, Duke, lifelong Nazi and white supremacist. I remember having these conversations with a friend of mine who he was a Trotskyist, and his thing was, man, we just need to go into the union halls and tell them that their class interests are being hurt by these kinds of politics. All right, yeah. And they won't vote for Duke if they just understood their class interests, right? Yeah, we tried that. And that didn't work. for a couple of reasons, and these are among them. First, let's be honest that this argument, the idea that class solidarity can be appealing to people just because it speaks to rational economic self-interest, is assuming a reality that may have been true at the time that the theory began to be developed in the nations of Europe, but we're living in a very different place with a very different overarching ideology. We're living in a nation where the myth of meritocracy, the idea that if one just works a little bit harder, one will be the boss, that didn't play so well in European nations. They knew that wasn't how it was going to go down. These were nations that bragged about their feudalism. These were nations that bragged about their ability to keep folks where they were in the class structure. So this idea that if I just work a little harder, I'll be the king, no, it won't go down that way. But in this country, the class system is developed in a much different way, in a way that traditional Marxists